Good evening and a warm welcome to you from Pakhuis de Zwijger, and welcome to another episode of Designing Cities for All. Of course, we know that Designing Cities for All is our 2-year-long research and activity program in which we take a deep dive into designing products, designing spaces and systems for all. After our first fellowship with the wonderful Lyongo Juliana, we are kicking off our second fellowship today. We've invited London-based Dark Matters Lab to take upon this task. We're going to get to know them a little bit better today. And also we'll get a sneak peek of what they're planning to research in the up and coming weeks. And they've invited a guest who I will be introducing later. If you would like to join our conversation, that is possible. Please go to the program page on www.dezwijger.nl, and there you can log into Zoom, and through the Q&A function you can ask questions to the people who are joining here and joining us here in the program. Well, on to our first guest here in the studio, that is Liz Corbin. A warm welcome to you, Liz.
Hello.
You're a material researcher, you're a designer and director of Metabolic Institute.
I am.
Can you explain what is Metabolic Institute?
Sure. Metabolic Institute is based here in Amsterdam. We focus on sustainability issues from a global perspective, as well as how we can expedite the transition to a circular economy. We are one research institute. We operate like a think tank, but the reason why I feel we're so special is we're actually part of the larger metabolic ecosystem, which is really 3 entities working together. So we have the think tank, which is the institute, we have a consultancy, and we have a ventures building arm. And we all operate as an ecosystem under a common mission, which is to...
What is the definition of an ecosystem within this realm?
An ecosystem for us is something that's greater than the sum of its parts, really. So Metabolic started in 2012 as a consultancy, and really wanting to take on the global economy and support it to transition to a fully fundamentally sustainable state. And I think what the team realized after years of really impactful work is actually working directly with individual corporations was just one string in your bow that you needed to really have efficient and high impact change in the sector. So that's when we brought on the think tank, which really primarily works with academics and is very much more public facing, looking at these global sustainability challenges, the root causes, the key drivers, the key barriers. And then we have our venture building arm too that really focuses on systemic ventures and scaling their impact. So for us as an ecosystem, it's not necessarily about each individual entity and the impact that they have, but the kind of impact we can have as a common cohort being driven towards the same mission.
And how does that go beyond, so to speak, marketing? Because it's lovely that you explain how it works, but does it work? Because every company wants to be the sum of its co-workers. Nobody says, okay, I want to diminish my co-workers. Actually, everybody wants to be a sum of it. How does it work in practice? Could you give us examples?
Yeah, I think it works in practice. It's very much of our own social engineering, and it's a continuous experiment that we're kind of designing and refining over time. But what we've found is that within the Institute, because we are not market-based at all, we're kind of pre-competitive, as most industry folk would call us. We're really in the academic space, and our key function as a think tank is to take the cutting-edge research that's happening inside academia and translate that into insights and a kind of vocabulary that's a little bit more digestible by people. I was an academic, so I think I can say this, that a lot of academic research gets bogged down in journal papers that are, 1, behind a really expensive paywall, and 2, written in a way that the majority of the population can't access. So we played that key translation role of taking academic research into real-world experimentation with broader public engagement. And in that regard, what we're able to do is do that deep dive research that's often quite self-directed on key emerging issues, the real systemic barriers. We're not beholden to any one client, which is nice. We can be a little bit more opinionated in that regard. But then all of those insights are really funneled into the consultancy, so they can actually more progressively mentor and support corporates to take on more and more progressive targets and operationalization plans. All of that gets fed into the ventures team, because what we're also seeing in the research and the consultancy side is where are the key entrepreneurial gaps and key innovation gaps that just are fundamentally not at scale yet. And that's where the ventures comes in. So there is a journey that we're really trying to systematically tackle together.
That's very interesting to hear, and thank you for explaining that. My final question before we go to Dark Matters Lab is, here at the Designing Cities for All, we are discussing systemic change, and one of the key themes that was mentioned also by Indy, who we will speak to later, is who is taking a seat at the table, who has something to say. If you base yourself on academic research, don't you exclude people, that are just experiencing life as is?
I wouldn't say we're based in academic research. For us, we're really the kind of human, real-world translator of those kinds of insights, which I think is really important, because what we're focusing on is more of that kind of quadruple helix vibe, where we are able to bring in academic experts that are world-renowned for their research, but rather than enabling them to remain in their lofty towers, we're kind of putting them alongside real-world communities in longer-term research programming. So for us, it's those communities that are in the driving seat. And how do we pilot real-world change that benefits them and enables them to thrive using some of the cutting-edge research that NGOs and universities are bringing to the table.
Great. We will get to know a lot more about you later on in the program. So thank you for now. But first, I would like to introduce our next fellows to you all. Of course, they are Indy Johar. He's an architect, designer, and co-founder of Dark Matter Laboratories. Indy, are you there?
I am. Hello.
There you are. Warm welcome to you. And you're joined by Joost Beunderman. He's an urbanist, a writer, a researcher, and the director of Dark Matters Laboratory. A warm welcome to you both. Indy, we heard you before in our programs as well, and we're very happy that you now, together with Joost, one of our fellows. This program is geared to get to know you a little bit better. Indy, as I mentioned, we saw you before. Inclusion is a very integral part of your philosophy, and I heard you speaking on Clubhouse as well. And there, it's also it's part of the way you think and your philosophy, so to speak. Can you tell us a little bit why inclusivity is so important for you and your work?
Firstly, thank you for inviting me, and delighted to be here. I think inclusion is not a choice. I think for democracies to move forward at the scale of the transition that we're facing, we are going to have to rebuild a societal compact. A societal covenant is almost foundational to address the scale of the challenges we face. And the challenges are coming at us at a rapid scale. So for me, inclusion is almost, if we're going to deal with any of the big societal challenges, I don't think democracies can construct the social legitimacy to manage it without building that social covenant. And that social covenant means that we have to address historic injustices as well as looking at the injustices we're creating for future generations. And only by building that compact can we build the capacity to build the transition. And I think this is a real stumbling block for democracies. We think it's without that social covenant, but with that social covenant, I think we can unlock the capacity for everyone to drive change at a scale that's unimaginable. And I think this is a real systemic lock-in for democracies. Democracies aren't about management theory, and management theory is too often at the center point of change in what we perceive as a model of change. Let's build a vision, let's build a critical pathway, and let's align it. Complex systems, as Liz was rightly, some of the images Liz was rightly pointing out to, is not a function of linear management theory. And that means the social covenant and the legitimacy of change is almost a foundational piece. So I think for me, inclusivity isn't just a moral agenda of like, oh, we must be fair. It's not like a side ad. It's all, without it, I don't think democracies move forward. And they will either have to turn towards tyrannies and autocracies, or they will not be able to make the transition. So I think this is a foundational piece. Thank you.
I totally wholeheartedly agree with you, but still, you said it's not a choice, and this social covenant should be including everybody. But at the moment, we experience in different governments and within different countries that it is a choice, that it's not a social covenant that they want to admit to or they want to put into practice. How do we make a systemic change in order to have the political parties or political leaders to first of all to realize that this is the way to go forward, and to, second of all, make that change?
I think this is the big tipping point we're in the middle of. I think management theory, which is a management theory which works on the idea you can understand and predict, command and control what you want. Our theories of change are all focused on control models. I think our political system has been built around a control thesis. It actually is struggling to deal with transition in complex transitions. So new public management, which has been the kind of mantra of how cities organize change, is actually fundamentally ineffective in the scale of the transition we're talking about. So for me, one of the big issues is rebuilding the capacities for change, rebuilding the capacities of our cities to be able to organize it, and also to be truthful. And I don't mean cities lie. I mean that we are not facing up to the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And because of marketing needs, I know so many cities that will privately tell you one thing, and in public, they'll say, well, we can't say that because that would deflate the market or that would do X, Y, Z. And this is because we've locked cities into an untruthful space, not because people are untruthful, but because there isn't the acceptance in society to have truthful conversations with each other. And only when we can create that safe space, I think, for example, I'm sure Joost will pick up on this, but the reality is we're facing probably a 3.5 degrees change in that current pathway. Reality is we're not in any way close to being able to deal with it. The reality is we are in a massive economic transition with large-scale impacts on labor markets and other things. So unless we start to talk seriously about the scale of change we're in the middle of, I don't think it's possible to have manifestable models of change. And I think we have to re-examine our tools and mechanisms of change. The role of government in this change is fundamentally different from an industrial Taylorist perspective to a model of change which recognizes democracies, recognizes that actually we need multitudes, we need movements of change, not management of change. And I think that's a fundamentally different perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much, Indy, for now. Joost, you're the director of Dark Matter Laboratories, but you're also an urbanist. I would like to know the nuance that you're bringing into your function. But as an urbanist, we see that although Indy says in the cities are untruthful spaces, we see that people still flock, before COVID at least, people still flock to the cities. That's where they want to live. But still, that it's a place of inequality. They're expensive. They're not affordable. And that's a movement that isn't likely to change very quickly. Or do you think differently from that?
So yes, so my umming and ahhing was about the fact that dark matter is a distributed system. We've got many directors in many different places, whether it is all across Europe or in Korea or in Canada, right? So I'm definitely not the only one. But to your question, I think what we're seeing is, of course, that cities are, like you say, attracting lots of people. We live in an age of the disappearing middle, so there is this, of course, winner-takes-all phenomena that seems to lead cities to be growing and growing, whilst other places shrink and suffer. But at the same time, I think what we've now seen with COVID, for example, is how actually the system is perhaps less resilient than it seems. Cities that are driven to an extreme, like London, for example, is to the extreme densities, and in a very commercial way, are less resilient. And guess what? People are already starting to vote with their feet, as it were. London is for the first time in 3 decades losing population. Right? It's a system solely geared towards a narrow series of interests, and guess what? It doesn't work. It doesn't hold up. It doesn't create resilience in times of pressure. So that's I think one thing to keep in mind. The other issue to keep in mind is that what you're saying also implies a real risk, right? Because we can say that our cities are becoming greener. Our cities are becoming, as spaces, ever more sort of bike friendly and pedestrian friendly. But that really awkward and awful phenomenon of sort of sustainability within the gates, right? We create spaces that we understand in our central cities that become ever more polished and ever more green in a very visible sense. But the systems they rely on, which is to say, the employees that are often prized out of our cities and are living in further and further ways of suburban areas, as well as the systems that feed our cities, etc., they are still as unsustainable as they ever were, right? And that's where an enormous amount of negative impacts are driven. And Doreen Massey, the sort of critical geography, really emphasized this point. Like, let's not confuse cities as a place with the spatial systems they rely on, which is where most inequalities and injustices are driven, right? Out of sight, but inherent to the places that kind of urban dwellers enjoy. And then the last point, of course, that actually cities are still, because of the way that impacts are felt and the way that people can meet each other, whether physically or through networks, are also places of innovation, right? It's where new political opportunities can often be tested out, and innovation opportunities are tested out in some cases more rapidly than they can elsewhere. So it's a mixed picture, right? It's a place of where environmental damage is created. It's partially a place where, through air pollution, etc., environmental damage is particularly felt. And it's also a space where new solutions and also new political constituencies, new movements for change can be articulated and driven, hopefully, to positive outcomes.
Right. And how does that idea, that concept, holds itself to the vision that Dark Matters Laboratories has?
Well, I mean, I think what we have focused on over the last couple of years is, it goes back to what Indy says, is this idea of change having to be micro-massive, right? So we have to find pathways towards distributed change making. And I remember something that Indy and I wrote years and years ago, in which we said, look, everyone likes to think about the big versus small, right? David versus Goliath, the plucky little community versus large institutions. In reality, the two have to walk together, right? We have to create institutional mechanisms that enable distributed change right across civic society. There is no other way, right? We need both to happen, and that's the complex design challenge that we've given ourselves, which is how do we think of and foster the development of these kind of institutions that are truly fit for the 21st century set of challenges that we face. That is our journey, and this is also why it's fantastic that we can do this fellowship, where we can explore parts of this journey with others. It's fantastic that Liz can join us. Wish we were there with you in the studio. But we really want to enjoy this fellowship as an opportunity to explore some of these questions, which are open questions to us as well.
We will get to know a little bit more about your fellowship later on. But first, I'm very interested in how you view cities as a knot of systems that are tied together. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Indy?
And I'd be delighted. I think one of the big challenges that we face is that we perceive, and we've learned to perceive, territory, nation states as a bounded idea. And this has come from a kind of world of, it's come from a conceptual framework of how we see the world by isolating objects, casting them in vitro. And I think the reality is, whether it's a nation state or the city, that none of these things are actually territorial definitions. Like Joost was saying, there are a knot of systems. And our governance model is being still conceived on the notion of territory management, when actually what we should be thinking about is governing these systems. And rather than having declarations of independence, we need to be thinking about declarations of interdependence. And how does that change our theory on governance and place management in a fundamentally different way? And that requires us to perceive the city through, and one of the reasons I'm very delighted Liz is here, through a kind of metabolic lens, through understanding its flows, not only of its flows of material flows, its energy flows, its water flows, but also human capital flows, which are significant, and the flows of ideas in other systems, intangible systems that make a city what it is. And that requires us to challenge our definition of urbanism to being an urbanism of a kind of the boundary of a M25 in London or its equivalent in Amsterdam or Rotterdam. The city is effectively a system, and we have to govern it through that lens. And that is a transformation in our theory of how we govern and how we operationalize ourselves.
Well, thank you. And we're very curious about what Liz has to say about that. We will listen to that in a minute. But I'm also very interested in your fellowship, your research. What is that going to entail? What are you going to research?
Right. So what we would like to focus on is squarely this: the journey of, on the one hand, really understanding what net zero means, and on the other hand, preparing for a 3-degree plus trajectory of climate change, which is, frankly, without a doubt, where we're currently headed on the basis of current trajectories. And it feels that this is particularly important because we live in this time of a very odd cognitive dissonance, right? No one who's looking at the trends and looking at the figures, looking at the data would deny that this is where we're headed, but we're still living as if it's not the case, right? We are sort of living in this morbid period, right? The validity of what we have is kind of being undercut, but we're not yet ready to move to a different set of behaviors and space, and we want to explore that because it's such an odd moment that we're living through, right? This cognitive dissonance, this talking about targets without structurally as a society committing to pathways, and we are wondering what that means, and also what that means for the Netherlands, because that's what we want to, of course, also focus on in this fellowship. And just exploring some of these implications around what Indy was saying. How do we genuinely, democratically transition in the age of also disinformation, in the age of political weaponization of certain topics? How can we make such big changes of the type that we think, and not just us, but that we kind of know are needed? How do we do that? How do we create a collective capacity to make sense of these complex issues? That's where we want to focus. We feel that at this point for us, using the fellowship for any other opportunity than to explore this honestly with a series of speakers and in a series of conversations would almost be a waste of time. This is where we want to focus our attention. The climate transition we need, our seeming inability to, as a society, have these conversations despite the best efforts of city governments, of lots and lots and lots of very committed people, of course, but understanding what that means and where we go from here.
Right. We've got a short clip that I would like to share with the audience, where we see the report of the United Nations in regards to climate change and to the warming up of the Earth. Let's have a look.
ourselves if we think we can fool nature, because nature always strikes back.
The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you.
Right, it's very impressive, a very impressive clip, of course, and a very current and an urgent matter as well, because as we see in Indonesia, they're looking into moving the city of Jakarta or moving into another capital because the ground is sinking and the sea levels are rising. And we thought that this was a theme that didn't happen in the Netherlands, but here just yesterday the discussion started about the city of Gouda, where the same happens. What happens with the city in a couple of decades when the levels of the sea levels are rising and the ground is sinking in. People do not realize yet how urgent the matter is. Indy, how can we have a systemic change in the mindset of the people as well? Oh, the connection seems to be a little bit off. Yeah, there you are. You're here.
I don't think this is just a people question.
Indy, your connection seems to be dropping a little bit.
Joost, can I give the question to you and we will return to Indy later?
Sure. I think the point that Indy is likely to make is that it's not just a people question. It's also very clearly, very importantly, an institutional question. Right? Mm-hmm. We have created a series of core infrastructures, whether it is corporate law, whether it is a measurement of our progress through GDP, etc., and so on, that make it very, very hard to collectively take decisions that fundamentally favor the long term. And so it's the putting it back on people alone it's basically Tony Blair saying that to combat climate change, walk the stairs a little bit more often than take the lift, right? Which as we know is insubstantial, and because it's so insubstantial, it's actually more than counterproductive, right? It's perpetuating a lie. So we need to dig into the dark matter of our institutions and how they preference certain pathways, as well as having the conversation about, okay, how do we change people's mindsets?
Yeah, right. I agree with that completely. And it's an intersection of different kinds of themes, because what you're going to research also connects with more democracy, distributed and a sustainable future. That intersectional part of your fellowship. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, and I don't know if Indy is whether we've really lost him, but well, let's put it this way: we know that over the last century or so, we've been almost like socialized into the wrong idea of what humans are, how they make decisions, and how they interact with each other. Right? We've put humans as kind of selfish, driven by short-term, so-called rational economic decision-making patterns, and we know that's not true. Humans are sociable, want to be sociable. Actually, loneliness is one of the key sort of drivers of ill health at the moment. We have by not recognizing how interdependent we are, how different environmental factors drive our long-term ability to learn. We know that air pollution and even temperature rises can impact our ability to learn. So, but by not recognizing those kind of factors, we've done ourselves a great disservice, right? And we need to enable our institutions to co-evolve with all the evidence of how we know humans actually function and how they'd like to function and what actually drives well-being, including when actually our patterns of consumptions have to drastically change.
Right. Thank you so much for now, Joost. Liz, we've covered a lot of topics. As Indy said, we shouldn't have a declaration of independence, but a declaration of interdependence. And by understanding the connections that there are between different kinds of systems, we can also understand the flows of the city. Can you tell us a little bit more about the flow of a city?
Sure. So Metabolic is called Metabolic because we are one, kind of industrial ecologists by nature, but two, really inspired by taking a system like a city and looking at how it could operate more like a natural metabolism. So like a natural ecosystem or a natural system, which is a far cry from how most human-designed economies currently operate.
How do they operate now?
Well, you've heard this big, a lot of talk around the linear economy, which of course is the case. Most cities are extremely linear at this moment. You know, materials are coming in the form of products which we know nothing about. They're being consumed for a very short period of time, most of the time, and then they're being relegated as waste. And because I very much agree with what Indy's saying, a lot of our governance systems at the moment are in a ethos or mindset of efficiency and managerial control. Those resources are often being incinerated, and we think this is a good thing. Like there's this idea that incineration to energy is a green solution, when in actuality it's not, and it's contributing massively to climate change. Consider then something like a forest, right? A natural metabolism and environment that's been living for billions of years. An entire forest ecosystem is built up with a really common set of natural building blocks, common nutrients that actually are also the nutrients we need to fuel our bodies, right? Fats, proteins, sugars, minerals. Because that entire system has basically been built off a protocol of just that really small subset of materials, it means that everything can be continuously reabsorbed. So a tree falls and decays into the soil, and there is no waste in that ecosystem. It fundamentally fuels new organism growth.
So that circular thinking is very important. It triggered a thought of me, because the circular system within a forest works as well. But every once in a while, there's this huge forest fire where everything gets burned down and everything's, so to speak, reset, because it builds itself up very quickly as well. Maybe we look at the climate change in a different perspective. Maybe this is the reset that nature gives us. So we get rid of a lot of people, rid of a lot of systems, and then we can start building again. What do you think of that parallel?
That maybe it gives us an out on climate change in too graceful a way, because indeed, you know, we are in that age of the Anthropocene. So a lot of the natural reactions that we see are not what Mother Nature would have pre-designed. They are 100% triggered by our economic systems, as you saw with those exponential graphs that were shown earlier. But I think what we are seeing and what we have seen as real-world impacts of climate change have hit our countries, like the bushfires and so on, is Mother Nature crying out and demanding a reset. So whilst I personally am a bit of a stubborn optimist myself, and I do believe that it is possible for us, if we really work in a consorted, truly committed way, we can get to 2 degrees. It's not going to be without complete fundamental reset. And it's, we've taken too long, so Mother Nature is now forcing us to, whether we like it or not.
She is actually forcing us at the moment. Indy, are you back? I hope we've connected to you again. No, you're gone. So we can let's continue the conversation here. That reboot, that reconnection that we need. What ingredients are necessary in order to realign ourselves again with what you say Mother Nature needs or wants?
Yeah. I agree with Joost and Indy, unsurprisingly, that it's really a lot about that dark matter of what's incentivizing us to have designed our economy in its current state.
Yeah.
What's locking us into this existing paradigm, and how do we have a full systems reboot, really at a much, much, much deeper level than telling consumers just to eat plant-based meat rather than red meat. And that's the kind of work that I think both Metabolic and Dark Matter Labs are really interested in. So how do we incentivize financial systems to take the longer road and the patient investment game that we all know we need for green infrastructure? How do we get national and municipal governments to stop managing a system based on economic efficiency and towards really systemic reinvigoration of whether that's a biosphere or a local community. There's some use cases now out there, I think, that really show us promise and show us a potential road forward. But I agree, it's very much that deeper logic that we need.
Yeah, Indy, you're back, so as we can see. So happy to have you here again. Lish just shared with us that she's an optimist, and I would like to oppose that optimistic theory. How would you react if I say, as a humankind, with the systems that we are developed now and that we're used to, we're not able to change that, not when we're forced by disasters in order to do that. So even the imminent disaster creates the cognitive dissonance, so we don't see it until it's here. So it's nice to achieve and strive for that, but it's not realistic for us to really change systems fundamentally. What would your reaction be?
I think for the average and the kind of middle, this is true. Okay? But I think it will take 1 or 2 nations that will unlock this. And I think it operates at 2 levels. I think nations are going to have to rebuild democratic nations are going to have to rebuild the social covenant. We're going to have to re-understand not the risk to ourselves only, but the risks we generate for future generations, which is completely unpriced or calibrated in our system of risk. So we do not look at the massive effects we're generating for future generations and on this planet and in our nation states. Then we're going to have to rebuild our capacities as democracies to operate in this world of strategic risk in combination with large scales of uncertainty. And that requires a fundamentally different allocation theory from government and a fundamentally different idea of how you do system change, which isn't about government driving it, but is about constructing multitudes of change, distributed capacities for change, distributed accountabilities, new forms of peer-to-peer accountability to drive that. And then finally, I think it's also really, really plausible to look at the future as a new idea of human-machine ecological development. I think we're also into a new paradigm relationship between what it means to be human, how it's augmented by machines, but in a new ecological relationship. And I don't mean that in a surface way. I mean that in our relationship to nature, which is moving from that being of resource to being one of interdependence, and one that recognizes sovereignty of nature in relationship to being human. It also requires us to imagine a new world where human development, the human is not a bad robot, which is acting like a machine, but is actually in a new symbiosis with the capacities of machine capabilities to create whole new complementary logics, where we don't talk about just the individual intelligence that we farm in a city. We're building the collective intelligence of the city as a system and building that capability. So there is a new future to be prospected and imagined, but that requires us to deal with some of the structural covenants that are on the table. This is not beyond our wit, and if you look back in history, we have done extraordinary things as human civilization to transgress and move things that we thought were unimaginable.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, I would say, okay, I can give you lots of examples, whether it's the birth of the NHS in the UK. At the point when the UK was absolutely bankrupt, the UK decided to build a national health service, not at the point of being rich. At the point that it was bankrupt, it considered that we needed to create a new social covenant. Denmark in 1830, I think it was 1833 or around that, 1817, built a whole education service when it had just come out of bankruptcy. You've got 1833 in the UK, when effectively labour rights were, we were in a massive dislocation between the return on labour to the return on capital. The UK turned around and effectively got rid of slavery in the UK, and the UK at that time was a very large system. So now there's loads of things wrong in all these moments, but what I'm saying is there's capacities for us to do extraordinary things, and I think we often get locked into just going, the only thing that we did was go to the moon. We've done extraordinary things in which have been massive transformations. And I think we have to rebuild our capacity to think big. And I think this is really critical for democracies. We've become romantic foundationalists on the theory of democracy, being locked into parliaments which are no longer effective as mechanisms of dealing with complex change. And unless we're able to be critical about our decision-making structures of society, our mechanisms of building shared sense-making, shared covenants of change, and actually building a new capacity to understand risk, comprehend it, price risk not to ourselves but to other people, but at the center point, have a real vision for a machine-human ecological relationship, which is foundationally around human development, human-machine ecological development. I don't think this transition is possible, but I guarantee you, in my absolute number one bet, I think one or two nations will make this move.
I hope you're completely right. And then we move towards a positive restabilization. Joost, that positive restabilization, what could that be in our society?
Well, it could be many things, but what it won't be is the same in levels of sort of material consumption, for example, as we have now. So there's a group of people that we work with who based in California, who are supporters of our work. Fantastic people called One Project. They had a conversation recently, and hopefully we can invite one of their speakers, one of their team as a speaker in one of the future sessions. And the conversation there was, well, restabilization at the same levels at our current trajectory is impossible, right? So at an easy 0 to 1 degree climate change, which is already hefty, or already kind of causing lots and lots of disastrous effects across the world. It's almost impossible. There is a possible restabilization at a different level. One of the things that might imply, and think about this, right? They said, well, the consumption level in the States might drop back to what was the 1960s material consumption level. Now, apart from the fact that probably in the 1960s there were enormous cars and gas guzzlers and all sorts of calamitous pollution being caused that we still see in Florida with all the fertilizer spills that we're still sort of suffering the results from, let alone the imprint of the States on the United States on the world at that point in time, and complex patterns of colonization, etc. But think about that, right? So back 60 years in terms of consumption levels, what does that do to our collective psychology of how we measure whether we're going to be better off, right? What does that do to people's collective psychology about confidence in the future, and the idea that future generations will always be better off than the present generation, which is, by the way, a belief that has very much driven democracies over the last 100 years and is increasingly no longer doing so, right? Which is partially explaining political polarization. So restabilization at a different level will be a profound, I think, experience for 21st century societies, and one where again fostering the non-material parameters of human well-being, collective agency, not being lonely, etc., will be so much more important in order to sustain people's mental health, in order to sustain people's ability to learn and tell positive stories about the future, etc. So I think restabilization will be tricky, and it'll happen in the context of probably ongoing, unpredictable external events to do with the climate, to do with again pandemics, etc. So restabilization won't feel like restabilization, I think, is what I'm probably saying.
If you mention those events, I have the feeling that we have to brace ourselves. Indy, in the background, we see a picture of 4 critical missions for the future. Can you elaborate on that? What is important there?
I mean, for me, at the foundational transition that we're in the middle of, as Joost was kind of laying out, is 4 transitions of how we relate to the future, i.e. this point about we generating risks for the future and we're generating liabilities for future generations. And currently, most of our thinking of the future is that of colonization. Our debt structures are that about controlling the future and making it bend to our will. And there is a new type of relationship required with the future. Our relationship with nature, which is that of resource and consumption, as opposed to being in some form of cohabitation with nature. We're seeing some really interesting work going on in places like New Zealand, where rivers have been made self-sovereign, or forests are being made self-sovereign. So we're going to have to rebuild a new idea of nature as something that we are not distinct from nature. I would say the classic image of the astronaut in space is one of the most foundational mistakes at an iconic level of how we saw the world, where we could imagine humans being de-linked from nature, whereas actually we're an emergent form of nature itself, and that requires reconceptualization, not at an ideological level only, but also at an institutional level and a bureaucratic level. I think it requires us to reimagine our stewardship with the material world and not seeing it as an ownership model, but actually as a stewardship model, which is fundamental to a post-ownership society. And the post-ownership society is not a corporate idea of sharing where corporates own the resources, but a new commons thesis that's going to be required about public interest materials, subleasing, and how do you create that. And finally, it's also about a relationship with each other. I think most of our relationship with humans is fundamentally a relationship of control and quasi-servitude disguised under current employment laws. It comes out of a thesis of control, So I think this transition is built on a new relationship of recognizing how awesomely incredible every human being is, which is more powerful than any general artificial intelligence that's ever been created and will likely be created for at least 40 years. And that requires us to reimagine humans as not units of labor, time and monetarily bounded on the procedural work into a new economy of relationship, which recognize the emotional cognitive capacity of that development. So I think these 4 structures are almost 4 structural reconfigurations of relationship of humans to the world and vice versa. And without it, I don't think we make a transition, but with it, we will make a transition, which is absolutely necessary. And I think these are already in play. There's not something unique or new that I'm saying. These are all in play in some fashion or another. And but they are recasting, they're foundational recastings of how we see the world and how we've constructed the world since Newtonian times, in a way. There's been a constructed logic of the world which are challenging.
Right. If we reimagine humans, we also need new models, Liz, don't we? Do you see any indication that the new models are already there or maybe taking place at this moment?
Yeah. There's plenty of poor precedents, but there's also some new exciting structures, And to the potential pessimists of the room, of which you may be one.
I am certainly one.
It's, I keep getting reminded of this quote from Christiana Figueres saying, plenty of people tell me it's not possible to halve emissions in a decade, and I tell them I don't have the privilege to give up. It's not my right to give up on that path.
Yeah.
And I completely agree. I think we also what hasn't been a part of this discussion is that also developing global vaccines in such a short period of time was seen as completely unheard of. Prior to the COVID vaccine, it took 4 years. 4 years was the shortest duration of actually developing a global vaccine, and Pfizer did it in 9 months, because it was a global sense of urgency and real visceral need. And from that unlocked an enormous amount of financial investment. And all of a sudden, all the regulatory barriers and red tape that was in place were removed.
But it took some. It was at a certain cost as well. I mean, it's great that it went so fast, but it was at a financial cost, and the pandemic as well. It made people. No, it made the divide even bigger, especially with accessibility. Because if we talk about equal access, the vaccines are not equally accessible for the whole world.
Certainly not now.
Yeah, exactly.
Which the UK has a little bit to play in that, gents. But the human cost of COVID has been unimaginable. The financial cost is exactly what everybody should have been flipping the bill to do in the first place, with global pandemics that have preceded COVID. But if you also, you can never compare environmental and human costs, but the rate of loss that we've also experienced from climate change is unquantifiable already. We've lost 60% of global biodiversity at this point, of which we may never get back. So I guess for me, the question is how do we take something like the global response to COVID and start engineering a conversation around climate change in this way? There's also plenty of bad precedents. Donald Trump, in the COVID relief package in the U.S., sunk $10 billion into coal and fossil fuel, right? So, and I think that triggered an additional $100 billion from private investors. However, there's good precedents and good models. New Zealand, as Indy is saying, they've completely reorientated their public budget to a social contract and a socio-environmental contract around well-being. Yeah. France is completely making all of their financial bailouts contingent upon emission reductions. So there's a lot of these precedence cases that if we could aggregate them, and then I agree, empower 1 or 2 nation leaders to really take a proactive step in the right direction, then that'll have a ripple effect. And
in order to have a ripple effect, how should you measure success? If we look at New Zealand, for example, where well-being is put more central, how can we measure well-being in order for people to follow suit?
Well, stereotypically so. My answer to that is extremely holistically. I think at the moment, first of all, the way in which countries most often measure success is through GDP, which is the most lackluster thing that humans have designed yet to measure success. But I would also say singular KPIs like happiness, like the happiness index that Bhutan has put into place, those singular KPIs also aren't going to get us anywhere. It needs to be a fundamentally holistic form of measurement that's really looking at human well-being, access to public services and the quality of those, inclusive of that, but also things like education and social cohesion, at the very same time as biospherical metrics as well. So to what extent are we not just having a net zero impact, but a fundamentally net positive impact on our local biospheres?
Right. We've entered the final stages of our conversation, and this hour went by so quickly. Indy, back to you. Is there, my final question to you, is there a way to equip democracies, to equip countries or societies to make this transition into those new models?
I mean, there's many ways and many tools. I think the really big question here is, and I think this is a really important one, is this about loss aversion or is this about breakthrough? And I think in a way, there is structuring about we need to recognize the scale of risks that are coming, but also simultaneously recognize this will create a whole new way of life and being. And it will be a breakthrough to a new normal simultaneously. So I think we often see this as kind of, we often talk about decarbonization. Carbon itself is a symptom of a problem. It's a symptom. It's not the problem itself. The problem is fundamentally our relationships in the world. As we transform them, there'll be new breakthrough forms of value. And I think those breakthrough forms of value will transfigure and transform how we see value, how we create value, how humans exist in the world, and how we persist. And you could look at whether the deficits in our current system are so significant, and carbon is just one. Look at the kind of human lives lost, look at the human mental health issues around the world. I think I less and less worry about the value created on the other side, because I think this is a high value proposition. It's the only high value proposition transition. I don't think we have a choice. Right now, it's about government attention and really starting to deeply focus. My biggest worry is democracies start to think the only way to behave is to behave like autocracies in order to drive change. And that, I think, is the real risk that we're facing, is democracies misconfiguring themselves and transforming themselves into quasi-autocracies, which the left and the right are both almost advancing in a way to deal with change. And I think that will be the biggest loss. And without that deep structural distributed model of transition, a multitude of transition, and organization, a real democratic transition, I think we're in really dangerous territories in lots of different ways. So I think the real challenge for places is to embrace democracy, which feels difficult right now, which feels really complicated, but genuinely embrace it, invest in it to drive that transition. I would encourage countries to be looking at structural constitutional reform at moments like this and see that as a mechanism for what is a constitution for transition and what does it look like, and build those deep conversations.
Right, I think that you're completely right. And Joost, to finish the program with you, what is the first step as fellows that you are going to take?
Well, we have the opportunity to also publish a short list of books with which we'll do a book club where we can, with a group of students, explore some of these kind of foundational issues through looking at a range of inspirational authors. That's also an exploration for us. We will be planning 3 evening sessions where we get the chance to invite people to explore some of these questions with us, which will soon start to plan and publish. And again, I think we're super grateful. Right? This is an opportunity for us to dig deeper into some of these questions as well. We're pretty lucky that a lot of the people that we work with and a lot of the people that support our work are very happy to go on journeys with us that are really explorative, and that's what we want to do with this opportunity here at Pakhuis. Pakhuis is a platform that enables these deep conversations, and hopefully we can do that together over the next 3 to 5 months. And again, I think let's not shy away from this cognitive dissonance, right? It is there. I think it's probably there in all of us, right? I think we can all, I think, probably face up to the fact and sort of acknowledge that we're sometimes driven by dreams that don't quite stand up to scrutiny. And let's that would be, I think, my key hope to have a series of very honest and open conversations across this fellowship together.
Great. Well, we are looking very much forward to your fellowship, to the research and the journey you will be taking. And like you said, there will be a student book club that starts during your fellowship. And from May the 31st, we will start with a series of 3 live casts that are hosted by Joost and Indy. Joost, can you tell us a little bit about the book you selected for the book club, or is that still a secret?
It is not a secret. I think it's either already published or will be published soon on the Pakhuis website. Indy, you made the selection for the book that we're going to delve into probably deepest with the student book club. So go for it.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Joost. So there's 2 things. One, I would say one of the key objectives of this fellowship is to build a program. We want to design a kind of framework of how to work with cities in this adaptation. So that's one of the things we're going to keep coming back to everyone as a community to be part of that conversation of what that looks like. But in terms of the book, what we're looking at is the book called The Precipice, which is by Toby Ord, which looks at the idea of existential risk, but existential risk not to us, but existential risk to the human potentiality. What is the risk to humanity's potential? And how do we start to manage that and look at new ways of looking at existential hope? And what are the mechanisms for driving that forward? So that's going to be one of the key books that we'll be looking at in the book club.
Great. We're very much looking forward to that, and more information about the book will be published on the website of Designing Cities for All through the website of De Zwijger. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. We will be hearing a lot more from you in future, starting on May 31st, where we can see the first live cast that you will be hosting. Thank you for now.
Thank you.
Let me see. There's a couple of things that I would like to mention in relation to what we discussed today. You are invited to join our Designing Cities for All talk on April the 26th, and there we will be discussing the film Planet City, in which we can see that climate change is no longer a technological problem, but rather an ideological one, rooted in culture and in politics. And we've got a trailer for that as well. Let's have a quick look at the trailer. People are searching frantically for the trailer right now. Yeah, there we are. Yes, join us on April 26th for the screening of the film and our discussion with director Liam Young. That's happening on the 26th of April. And on May the 3rd, we will start a new series of 3 live casts about inclusion by design related to products, spaces, and systems. If you would like to have more information also about the Student Book Club, but also about what's happening and what program is happening, please go to the website of De Zwijger, www.dezwijger.nl. Thank you so much for sharing stories. Joost, Indy, Liz, thank you so much for being here. And we'd like to see you next time. If you want to see previous episodes of Designing Cities for All, you can see that on dezwijger.nl/DCFA as well. I wish you a very good evening and hope to see you at our next livecast. Bye-bye.